The first thing people notice is the silence. Not the polite kind, nor the comfortable hush of a library, but a heavy, pressurized silence that seems to settle into the very walls of the diner. Inside, the steam rising from the bowls of soup seems to curl slower, as if even the air is holding its breath. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink of cutlery provide the only rhythm until the door swings open and the temperature of the room drops. Min Jun walks in like he owns the air. He is not rushing, just certain, dressed in a sharp maroon suit with his hair slicked back. Behind him, three men in black suits, Min-jae, Gung-ho, and Young-ho, slide into the room, their eyes scanning corners and exits like they are mapping a chessboard. They do not need to speak. Every customer in the diner understands exactly what kind of men they are. A trucker at the counter keeps his eyes fixed on his bowl, and a couple near the window quietly signals for their check, avoiding eye contact at all costs. Min Jun sits at the counter, calm and unhurried, his fingers resting near a porcelain cup. From the end of the counter, Adama steps forward. She is 72 years old, a woman who has spent her life watching the world underestimate people who do not fit into its boxes. She wears a vibrant, patterned dress that stands in stark contrast to the sea of black suits behind the counter, her posture as straight and steady as a seasoned soldier. The room expects her to shrink back, to stay invisible, and let the danger pass. But she doesn't. She looks Minjun directly in the eyes, calm, clear, and unmoved, without a tremor in her voice. She speaks as if she were merely commenting on the weather. "Hello, sir. My granddaughter has a birthmark just like yours." The diner stops breathing. Min Jun's fingers freeze. It is not a reaction of anger, but something heavier, something that lives deeper than a threat. He turns his head slowly and deliberately toward her, exposing the dark, ink-shaped birthmark on his temple, testing whether she truly saw it or if she understood the weight of her words. "Your granddaughter," Minjun says, his voice low and controlled. "Her name." Adama does not flinch. "Adis," she says. The name lands in the room like a key, clicking into a lock that hasn't been touched in 12 years. While Minjun's face remains a mask of cold professionalism, his men catch the subtle shift. The quiet tension in his jaw, and the way his shoulders lift just a fraction. Something inside Minjun's chest has cracked wide open, and in that moment, the power in the room shifts from the man with the guns to the woman with the truth. 12 years ago, Minjun was not a boss. He was a young man with too many enemies and too few exits. A deal had gone wrong, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply unravels, leaving him bleeding, dizzy, and running through a service alley behind an apartment complex. His knees eventually gave out, and the cold brick wall caught him as he slumped toward the pavement. For a long stretch of dark seconds, the only thing keeping him conscious was his own breathing, ragged and too loud, a sound that felt like it could betray his position at any moment. He didn't see the window above him, but Adama saw him. She had been putting groceries away when a shape in the alley caught her eye, a person slumped and still where no one belonged. She didn't rush outside, and she didn't call the police. Adama believed in the law only the way one believes in something that has let them down enough times to teach them its shape. She knew what happened when a bleeding stranger was handed to a system not built to hold him gently. Instead, she called Amara, a community advocate skilled at helping the vulnerable navigate crises without getting swallowed by that very system. Amara arrived within minutes, her instincts as steady as Adama's hands. Together, they hauled the wounded man inside, patching him up with first aid and water, offering no lectures and asking no questions about gangs. However, Adama set a hard boundary in a voice that left no room for negotiation. "You leave the violence outside my door and you don't come back here unless you're ready to live differently." Minjun laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was unfamiliar. In his world, people usually wanted something: money, protection, or fear. Adama wanted change, the rarest ask anyone had ever made of him. As his eyes wandered like a wounded animal's, checking if the space was truly safe, they landed on a little girl asleep on the couch. She was hugging a stuffed animal, her face peaceful in the low lamplight. And there, at her temple, small and ink-dark and unmistakable, was the birthmark. Minjun stared at it longer than he meant to, a mark he had hated his whole life because it made him feel branded. But on the child, when it looked like a signature, as if she belonged to something bigger than fear. Before he disappeared back into the life already waiting for him, he placed a small coin in Adama's palm, a habit of his family to signal a debt. He looked at her, his voice finally dropping its guard. "Keep her safe," he said. "The world is loud. Protect her quiet." The small metal disc felt heavy in Minjun's hand, far heavier than its weight in copper and nickel should allow. It was an old habit, a tradition of his family's house that predated the blood and the maroon suits. A way of saying, "I owe this," a marker of a debt that could not be settled with mere currency. He looked down at his palm, then back at the sleeping child on the couch. Adis was barely more than a breath in the quiet room, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt impossibly fragile compared to the violence he had just escaped. His gaze remained fixed on the girl's temple. The birthmark was there, dark and jagged, a mirror image of the one hidden beneath his own hairline. He had spent his youth loathing that mark, viewing it as a brand that marked him for a life of struggle, but seeing it on her changed the architecture of his thoughts. On her, it didn't look like a curse. It looked like a map, a silent piece of evidence that he wasn't as alone in the world as he had believed. It was a signature of lineage written in skin, connecting his jagged past to her untouched future. Adama watched him from the shadows of the kitchen, her eyes unblinking and wise. She didn't ask for his name, and she didn't ask for a reward. She simply stood as a guardian of the sanctuary she had provided. Minjun realized then that this woman wasn't afraid of him, not because she didn't understand what he was, but because she understood something he didn't, that the power he carried was a burden, not a gift. He stepped toward the small table near the door and set the coin down. The metallic clink was the only sound in the room, a sharp punctuation to the silence. He didn't offer a handshake or a hollow thank you. Those things were for men who intended to return as friends. He was a man who lived in the dark, and he knew that his presence was a fire that could consume the very peace Adama had built. "I know I owe this," he murmured, his voice sounding foreign even to himself, stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. He looked at the child one last time, memorizing the way the lamplight hit the mark on her temple. It was a thread, invisible but unbreakable, stretching out from that night and into the years to come. He turned to the door, the cold night air already reaching for him through the frame. "Keep her safe," he repeated, his words a plea disguised as a command. "The world is loud. Protect her quiet." As he stepped out into the alley, the coin remained on the table, a promise left in the light. He disappeared into the shadows, a ghost returning to a world of noise, but a part of him stayed behind in that quiet room, tethered to a girl with a birthmark just like his. The quiet that Minjun had asked Adama to protect 12 years ago was no longer silent. It had begun to hum with a low, vibrating frequency of dread. It started not with a bang, but with the soft chime of a smartphone, the kind of sound that usually signals a mundane update, but now carried the weight of a physical blow. Adis, now 17 and possessing the same steady gaze her grandmother used to navigate the world, looked down at her screen. No name, no number. Just a sequence of words that implied a terrifying level of intimacy. "The mark you carry is a key. It is time to learn which door it opens." She didn't tell Adama immediately, not because she was afraid of the truth, but because she was a girl who had been taught that information was a currency you spent wisely. But the messages didn't stop. They became a rhythmic pressure, arriving with the cold precision of a ticking clock. They spoke of ownership and belonging, using language that suggested her body was a map someone else had drawn. They were anonymous, layered through spoofed servers and digital ghosts, but the intent was as sharp as a blade. Someone was trying to create the conditions for isolation, whispering through the screen that she should come alone, that the truth was a private matter that didn't include the woman who had raised her. Then the digital pressure took a physical form. Adis first noticed the sedan on a Tuesday. It was a dark, nondescript vehicle, parked 3 rows back in the school lot, its engine idling with a patient, predatory purr. The driver remained a silhouette behind tinted glass, a shape that didn't move, didn't look away, and didn't do anything except exist in her peripheral vision, like a word she couldn't stop reading. It followed her at a distance as she walked home, moving with a slow, amber lethargy that matched her pace. It wasn't an attack. It was a psychological siege, designed to let her know that she was being watched, filed, and waited for. The streetlights were coming on in that slow, hazy way they do in autumn when Adis realized the sedan was closer than it had been the day before. She didn't speed up, and she didn't look back, but her heart was doing something she refused to admit to anyone. She walked with her earbuds in, bag over one shoulder, projecting the image of an ordinary teenager, but her mind was mapping every exit, every open shop, and the distance to the diner. The car sat at the end of her block, a silent witness to her every move, waiting for the moment the silence would finally swallow her whole. Back at the diner, Adama watched the door with a different kind of vigilance. She had seen the way Adis clutched her phone, at the way the girl's shoulders had squared into a defensive line that reminded her too much of the man who had bled in her alley 12 years ago. The air in the neighborhood had changed. It felt heavy, the way it does right before a storm breaks. Adama knew that the quiet was being hunted, and as she looked at the old coin she still kept tucked away, she realized that the debt Minjun had acknowledged was no longer a memory. It was a looming necessity. The thread that connected the birthmark to the Mafia boss was being pulled by an invisible hand, and if they didn't act soon, the secrets of the past would become the cage of the future. The urgency in the diner had shifted from a simmer to a boil, but Adama knew that heat without direction only leads to burns. She didn't call the police, and she didn't call Minjun's enforcers to start a war in the streets. Instead, she reached out for a different kind of precision. Adabio arrived within the hour, a man who didn't look like he belonged to the world of shadows or the world of sirens. He carried a worn leather bag and a quiet, deliberate energy, moving like a surgeon who followed a nerve without unnecessary cutting. He sat at the end of the counter, far from the windows, and began the work of turning fear into a process. Adabio was a principled investigator, the kind of person who understood that in a world of digital ghosts and hidden lineages, the chain of proof mattered more than any single link. He didn't ask Adis how she felt. He asked for her phone. He began to document the messages, not just the words, but the timestamps, the frequency, and the metadata hidden beneath the spoofed numbers. He explained that the anonymity was the enemy's greatest strength, but it was also their primary tell. The spoofing itself, the way the messages routed through layered intermediaries, revealed a high level of technical sophistication. This wasn't a random stalker. It was someone with resources, someone who understood that the birthmark was a lever for coercion. Adabio spoke in a voice that was low and steady, providing an anchor for the room's rising tension. He laid out the strategy: preserve everything, verify the breaches, and refuse direct contact. He explained that whoever was behind the dark sedan was pushing for isolation. They wanted Adis to believe that her body and her history were secrets she had to manage alone. By bringing the threats into the light, by documenting them as evidence rather than treating them as a private nightmare, they were already beginning to dismantle the trap. Adama watched him, her hands folded over a towel, recognizing the same stubborn commitment to truth that she had tried to instill in her granddaughter. As Adabio worked, a name began to surface in the quiet spaces between his questions: Amina. He looked at the old photographs Adama provided, tracing the lineage that led back to the woman who had never named Adis's father. He realized that the thread didn't just connect the girl to a mafia boss, it connected her to a past someone was trying to weaponize. Someone out there knew exactly what that mark meant, and they were betting that a 17-year-old girl would be too frightened to ask for help. Adabio's presence changed the geography of the diner. It was no longer just a place of sanctuary, it had become an observation post. He mapped the routes Adis took, the timing of the sedan's appearances, and the digital trail of the messages, building a file that was methodical and damning. He caught Minjun's eye across the room, and the look that passed between them was one of mutual recognition. They were different men with different methods, but they both understood that visibility was the only thing that truly stops a predator who relies on secrecy. Adabio wasn't there to provide redemption or to start a fight. He was there to make the invisible visible. As he closed his leather bag, the weight of the situation felt different. Not lighter, but more manageable. The truth was no longer just a memory held by a grandmother. It was becoming a weapon in its own right. And the thread was finally being pulled from the other end. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from a sanctuary of shared secrets to a war room where the air tasted of copper and cold intent. Minjun stood near the counter, his presence a dark, immovable pillar against the morning light. His first instinct, the old, fast one that had kept him alive in the underworld, was to act with total authority. He spoke of safe houses, of tinted windows, and of disappearing into a silence deep enough to swallow the threat whole. He laid out a plan to relocate Adis and Adama before the sunset, treating their lives like chess pieces to be moved off a board that had grown too dangerous. But Adama stopped him before he could finish the sentence. She didn't raise her voice, but she stood with a firmness that made the enforcers in the room shift their weight. "You don't move her," she said, her voice steady and absolute, not without her knowing, and not without her say-so. She wasn't angry, but she was immovable, reminding the room that she had spent 72 years watching the world try to relocate people who didn't fit into its boxes. She looked Minjun in the eye, the same way she had 12 years ago in the alley, and made it clear that she had not raised a granddaughter to be an object in a man's game of protection. Adis stepped forward then, her shoulders squared and her eyes sharp with a fire that Minjun recognized as his own. She was 17, and the child who had slept peacefully on the couch while he bled was gone, replaced by a young woman who had spent days understanding exactly how the trap of fear worked. She looked at the man who might be her father and didn't offer a thank you or a nod of compliance. Instead, she offered a challenge. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. "That's what they want. If I vanish, they win the silence." She looked at the leather file Adabio had been compiling and then back at Minjun. Her voice didn't waver. "I want answers with proof. My life isn't a secret, and it isn't yours to manage." She demanded the truth on her own terms, not as a story told by a grandmother or a legacy claimed by a stranger, but as a documented reality. She wanted the DNA tests, the records, and the evidence that Adabio was chasing. She understood that if she ran now, she would be running for the rest of her life, and she refused to let fear decide her name. The room held that moment for a long stretch of seconds. Minjun didn't flinch, and he didn't argue. He looked at Adis and felt a flicker of recognition that was more frightening than any rival syndicate. He saw the same stubborn refusal to let the world decide his fate, the same jagged edges that made her a person rather than a pawn. He realized then that he couldn't own the answer to who she was, even if the birthmark proved they were of the same blood. He nodded slowly, fully, because he understood that the only way to protect her quiet was to respect her strength. "Agreed," he said. the word sounding like a vow. The truth belongs to the person it's about. Adama exhaled, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. The lines were drawn, and for the first time, they weren't being drawn around Adis, but by her. The evening air had turned brittle, the kind of autumn chill that makes the shadows feel longer and more substantial than the objects casting them. Adis was leaving a school event later than usual, her bag heavy over one shoulder and her phone held tight in her palm. The parking lot was a vast, half-empty expanse of asphalt, illuminated by streetlights that flickered with a slow, amber hesitation. She walked with the steady, aware rhythm she had practiced for days. Not fast enough to look afraid, but not slow enough to look careless. The dark sedan was there, parked 3 rows back. It was the same shape, the same driver, and the same patient idling engine that had become the soundtrack to her anxiety. The car didn't move as she approached her own vehicle. It simply watched, its windshield reflecting the orange glow of the lot like the eyes of a predator waiting for the herd to thin. It was pressure, the slow and patient kind that said it could wait longer than she could stay brave. Adis felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but she didn't run. She stood her ground in the open space, a 17-year-old girl refusing to be swallowed by the dark. Then, the convoy arrived. It didn't come with sirens or the screech of tires. It moved like water around a stone, deliberate, quiet, and filling the space without breaking it. Min-jae and Gung-ho stepped out first, their black suits nearly invisible in the twilight. They didn't approach Adis directly, and they didn't draw weapons. Instead, they positioned themselves with architectural precision, one on each side of the aisle between her and the sedan. They angled their bodies so that the driver's line of sight was narrowed, then blocked, not with aggression, but with the sheer physical presence of men who knew how to occupy a room. Jung-ho stayed in the lead car, but the vehicle didn't stay still. It drifted forward with a ghostly silence, parking at an angle that controlled the exit of the lot. Anyone watching from the school windows would have seen a man checking his phone or a car waiting for a student. But anyone inside the sedan saw a door that had just become impossible to leave through without being noticed. The secrecy that the predator relied on was being dismantled by witnesses who were more organized and more dangerous than itself. Then Min-jun stepped out of the maroon car. He didn't rush. He walked toward Adis with his hands open and visible, the way you approach something fragile that you don't want to startle. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low enough that only she could hear it, cutting through the hum of the idling engines. Adis, he said, using her name with a careful, quiet reverence. Your grandmother asked me to help. Adis looked at him, her eyes tracing the birthmark on his temple, and then she looked at the sedan. The predatory vehicle finally moved, but it wasn't a forward strike, it was a retreat. The driver reversed out of the spot with a sudden, desperate speed, the kind of speed that isn't brave. It fled the lot without turning on its headlights, disappearing into the street the way a shadow vanishes when the light gets too bright. Predators hate witnesses. And they especially hate being seen by men who understand the architecture of a hit. The parking lot settled into a different kind of quiet. Min-jae and Gung-ho returned to their car without a word, their task of witnessing complete. The space felt lighter now, not because the danger had evaporated, but because the threat had revealed its own cowardice. Adis watched the empty space where the sedan had been, then turned back to Min-jun. Her voice was quiet, but it had lost its tremor. You recognized me before you even met me, she said, her gaze searching his. Why? The diner was bathed in the pale, clinical glow of Adabio's laptop, the screen displaying a web of data that looked like a shattered mirror. Outside, the night was still, but inside, the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the heavy, airless quiet of a room waiting for a verdict. Adabio didn't look up immediately. He traced a line on the screen with a steady finger, his movements as precise as a surgeon's. When he finally spoke, His voice was low, carrying the weight of a truth that had been buried under 12 years of dust. "The messages aren't coming from a ghost," Adabio said, his gaze shifting from the screen to Adama. "And they aren't coming from Minjun's rivals." He explained that the trail, though layered through spoofed servers and digital decoys, had a specific texture. The pressure, the timing of the sedan, and the language of ownership were all hallmarks of a different kind of predator. This was a fracture of secrecy, a chain of events triggered not by Minjun's appearance in the diner, but by someone who had been watching for a long, long time. Adabio revealed that the intermediaries used to send the messages were linked to a name that had surfaced in a data breach years ago, a name tied to the life of Amina, Adis's mother. The room seemed to contract at the mention of her name. Adama's hands, usually as steady as stone, tightened around her apron. Adabio laid out the file. The source wasn't interested in a mafia war. They were interested in a legacy. Someone from Amina's past, someone who knew the value of the birthmark and the blood it represented, had been waiting for Adis to reach an age where she could be claimed. Amina knew, Adabio said quietly. He pointed to a series of archived messages he'd recovered, not threats, but frantic inquiries from a decade ago. Amina hadn't been mysterious because she was hiding a crime. She was private because she was hiding a child from a world that viewed people as assets. The birthmark wasn't just a mark of lineage. To the people behind the sedan, it was a brand of ownership. They didn't want to hurt Adis. They wanted to collect her, to use her connection to Minjun's blood as leverage in a game of power she was never meant to play. Adama looked at the birthmark on Adis's temple, her eyes filling with a grief that looked like fire. "Amina never talked about it," she whispered. She was afraid of who would use it. The realization settled into the room like lead. The threat wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated attempt to engineer a situation where a teenage girl would hand herself over voluntarily, believing she belonged to a truth that was actually a trap. Minjun stood in the shadows, his jaw tight. He understood this logic better than anyone, the logic of people who treat stories as weapons and family as currency. But the fracture of secrecy had worked in their favor. By bringing the threats into the light, by documenting the pattern and the links to Amina's past, Adabio had done what bullets never could. He had made the invisible visible. The predator was no longer an enigma. It was a documented entity, and in the light of day, its power was already beginning to crumble. Adis sat still, her fingers tracing the old coin on the counter, realizing that her mother's silence hadn't been a lack of love, but the ultimate act of protection. The air in the diner no longer felt like a vacuum. It felt like the moment before a gavel hits the wood. Minjun stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the streetlights. But his hand was nowhere near the holster of his weapon. In the underworld, he commanded, problems were usually solved with the sudden, violent erasure of the opposition, but tonight he was learning a different kind of power. He watched as Adabio organized the final pages of the file, a thick, methodical stack of evidence that transformed digital ghosts into a tangible criminal conspiracy. The redemption didn't come with the flash of muzzle fire or the screech of tires. It came in the quiet, clinical exchange of information. Adabio had traced the anonymous messages back to their origin, uncovering a chain of coercion that linked the dark sedan to a predatory figure from Amina's past who specialized in leveraging hidden lineages for profit. The file contained timestamps, metadata, documented stalking patterns, and the link to the data breach that had targeted Adis's history. It was a weapon made of paper and truth, and in the light of the legal system, it was far more lethal than any lead projectile. "We don't chase," Minjun said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor the room. "We document. We let the light do the work." It was a pivot that cost him the most, to choose the slower, more disciplined path over the satisfying surge of a direct strike. He looked at Adama, who stood with her hands folded, her expression one of grim validation. She had told him 12 years ago to leave the violence outside her door, and tonight, he finally understood that the most effective way to protect her sanctuary was to use the very system she had once doubted. As the file was handed over to the appropriate authorities, principled men and women who Adabio had vetted for their integrity, the shadow enemy began to collapse. Visibility for people who rely on secrecy is the only thing that truly stops them. The messages on Adisa's phone abruptly ceased. The dark sedan, which had been a constant looming presence, vanished from the neighborhood as the people behind it realized they were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Their leverage, built on the darkness of the unknown, evaporated the moment it was categorized as evidence. Adabio's file did what bullets never could. It made the threat stay gone. It wasn't just about stopping a car. It was about stripping away the enemy's ability to ever claim ownership over Adisa's story again. The shadow enemy wasn't just defeated. It was rendered irrelevant by a 17-year-old girl who had looked at a room of dangerous men and demanded proof instead of fear. Minjun watched the authorities drive away with the documentation, and for the first time in his life, his shoulders dropped just a fraction. He had protected a quiet, not through force, but through a choice to act differently. The diner, once a place of lethal silence, was finally just a diner again. Adama looked at the coin on the counter, then at him, acknowledging the man who had traded his iron grip for the weight of a principled truth. The diner returned to its natural state, the morning sun streaming through the windows to illuminate the slow, lazy dance of dust motes. The heavy, pressurized silence that had once occupied the room was gone, replaced by the comforting, mundane sounds of the refrigerator's hum and the distant whistle of a kettle. Adama sat at the same counter where it had all begun, no longer a woman bracing for a storm, but a grandmother ready to help her granddaughter set down a weight she had carried for far too long. Between them lay the old coin, worn smooth by years of being held, a relic of a debt that had finally been acknowledged in a way that mattered. Adise sat with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, her eyes fixed on the coin. She looked at Minjun, who stood by the door, not as a predator ready to pounce, but as a man waiting for permission. The danger had been dismantled by evidence and process, but the question of the birthmark still hung in the air, a silent note waiting for its resolution. Adise finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying a clarity that cut through the remaining uncertainty. "What about the mark?" she asked. "What does it actually mean for me?" Minjun didn't pretend to have a clean answer, because he knew that a clean answer was often just another form of control. "The mark could mean everything," he said, his voice stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. "Or it could be a coincidence. Birthmarks work that way. They are hereditary, or they just happen. The only way to know is the right way. A test you choose to take, or one you don't." He paused, looking at her with a recognition that went deeper than blood. "But here is what I know for certain. Whatever the answer is, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't give anyone a claim. It doesn't make you less yours." Adama leaned forward, her gaze softening as she looked at the young woman she had raised. "The world will try to label you," she said, her voice a steady anchor. "It'll point to the mark, point to your history, point to anything it can use to tell you who you are before you've had the chance to figure it out yourself. But you choose your name, not the mark, not the messages, not anyone else." Adise didn't nod and she didn't cry. She simply absorbed the truth of it. A truth her mother, Amina, had died protecting. She reached out and touched the coin, then looked at Minjun. She saw a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, but had finally learned the value of a boundary. "I'm not your redemption," she told him, her voice firm and grounded. "And I'm not the thing that makes your story come out right. I'm a person, and my story is mine." Minjun didn't flinch. He simply nodded, accepting the boundary as a gift. He picked up the coin one last time, feeling the weight of the night 12 years ago and the morning today. He set it back down in front of Adama, not as a marker of debt or a symbol of ownership, but as a reminder of a lesson learned. I can't undo what I've been, he said, his eyes meeting Adama's, but I can choose not to repeat it. Adama looked at the man and then at the girl, seeing the thread that connected them across years of silence, a thread that wasn't a cage, but a bridge. Then choose, she said simply. Adis picked up the coin, turned it over in the light, and then set it down gently and deliberately. The quiet in the diner had finally stopped being afraid. Truth didn't need fear to be real, and family, they finally realized, I didn't need force to be family.